Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute. This is ArtNet News' new micro-podcast hosted by Margaret Kerrigan, who's the site's news editor Europe. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news expertly compiled by the ArtNet Pro editorial team.
There's something maximal there, but I also think there's something really sadly reduced or minimal, which is this sort of like flight from the specific mediated work and from that invitation to contemplation.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. There's so much culture now that it definitely can be hard just to keep up, let alone to think about it all as a whole. But that only makes the effort to find perspective more important. It's not always clear when you're in the thick of it, but almost certainly when people in the future look back, they will see more clearly than we do the common concerns beneath the fragmented surface of the culture of the 2020s. The literary scholar Anna Kornbluh has an idea about all this. She argues that what characterizes the art of the now might be, in fact, a particular hunger for now-ness. Her book, published this year by Verso, is called Immediacy, or The Style of Too Late Capitalism. Across a broad array of culture, both high and low, Kornbluh tracks, as she writes, immediacy as a master category for making sense of 21st century cultural production. She shows how the drive towards immediacy can help explain a vast array of developments and asks why. It's a thin but challenging book. Immediacy was my pick for our summer reading list, and I'm not the only one who has found it useful. In the magazine Art Review, author Alex Niven wrote that Kornbluh has done better than almost anyone in recent memory to define the elusive, claustrophobic spirit of the age. I thought this was heady terrain to explore, and Kornbluh joined me to be my guide to it. Anna Kornbluh, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real delight.
So I was fascinated by your book almost from the moment that I heard its title, because it is something that gives you a concept to hold together a lot of the different stuff you're seeing in the world. Just to start out, what's your background? How long have you been working on this book? Where did the idea for immediacy come from?
Sure. I'm so glad you said that, because giving you a concept to hold things together is totally the goal of the book.
Sure, it's very much your project in a way.
Yeah. And the title is structured in a way that kind of quotes a book that it is a companion to or sort of a follower of Jameson's postmodernism or the cultural logic of late capitalism. The idea of immediacy came to me, I think about the critic's job being sort of to notice stuff, right? And I started having this sensation that a lot of artworks I was seeing, a lot of literature I was reading, a lot of galleries I was going to, TV I was watching on the production side, but also a lot of the critical discourse I was immersed in with my colleagues and my students and with sort of people I'm reading online was oriented around this kind of demand that our contemporary aesthetics should be really transparent, should really have a message, should really be available to rapid uptake, right?
Yeah.
Get it. And that kind of sense came to me very acutely about literature, because as a real scholar of older literature than the present, of the 19th century novel and the history of the novel, I was really struck that the pleasure reading I was doing in contemporary fiction and some of the teaching I was doing in contemporary fiction was bringing to me texts that were just consistently written in the first person. And that's not true of the history of the English novel. It's written in a third person majority. So that was one of the first things that I kind of noticed. Why aren't there any novels in the third person in our contemporary scene? And what could be explaining that? But again, there also was just sort of this broader effort to connect that observation to why do we have a lot of kind of television shows and cinematic genres and modes that are really seem to be committed to authenticity as some of their stylistic vocabulary and to like intensity and sort of laying bare, and to do so in confessional kinds of ways. So just kind of starting to put those noticing of different media together.
Yeah, the word itself just snaps a lot of things together for me. It does a lot of work on its own as a concept. It's like, oh yeah, across all these different fields, art, but also literature and a bunch of other stuff that you talk about in the book, immediacy sums up this drive. And it is a book with a kind of dizzying array of stuff. I mean, you talk about everything from secession to various contemporary philosophers that people in art might be familiar with, to all kinds of literature, to the rage for the confessional essay, the personal essay boom. But it does begin in immersive Van Gogh. And I guess you actually did a little bit of field work going to, what is it called? Van Gogha?
That's what I call it, yeah.
I guess describe this. What's its importance to you?
Sure. Why does the book begin there? I mean, everybody must be noticing that these immersive spectacles are all over the place, right? And that they're one of the kind of signature ways that we're engaging with art right now. And so how can you explain them and what are they? And also, I think that there is, as much as there's a mass enthusiasm for them, there's something like really strange about them and maybe even irritating, or you might see sort of critics be dismissive of it. But so I wanted to understand like what is going on that makes it so that we want to have not an encounter with a painting and its brushstrokes and maybe like a little bit of text that explains its materials and its date that it came from. But instead of that kind of encounter with that bounded work, this whole body optimized sensational experience where there's almost the dancing, like the synthesized pop, right? And it's just booming, booming, booming. And the images are projected in all dimensions and they lose all sense of what their original kind of perspective or construction was. And that this form of omnisensory absorptive address is supposed to be a kind of better than the original artwork.
Yeah.
I was trying to sort of figure that out. And to me, even though there's something like maximal about those experiences, right? They have a lot of sound, they have a lot of light, they're sort of engaging the whole body. And especially if you go to the yoga class, they're engaging the whole body. There's something maximal there, but I also think there's something really sadly reduced or minimal, which is this sort of like flight from the specific mediated work and from that invitation to contemplation that we might associate with art.
Yeah, and actually to me, I was thinking there's something about the way you think about immediacy that has to do with medium, which, for artists is a very important concept. And the idea that like you master a medium, you have some kind of discipline, that you submit yourself to a certain set of ideas, a certain way of doing something. And something that I feel like you tease out in the book is the way everything becoming more immediate, and this drive towards immediacy pushes people away from medium, because that involves thinking through a set of rules, a certain kind of tradition, something that takes a little bit more time. And so I was thinking it is significant that in Van Gogha, to use your term, these things don't really seem like they go together at all. It's Van Gogh and yoga, they're like just two totally disparate things kind of mashed together because they feel right.
Yeah, totally. So it's so great. You just hit on two things there. One is this almost rejection of medium. And then the other is like the slurry that results from that, or the mishmash, or the kind of mixing together that somehow results from that. Why is it that medium, which the specificity of which we might think of as how to train artists, how to train critics, and not just as submitting yourself to a discipline, but that there are real things that media offer, that painting can do things that fiction doesn't, and vice versa. And being really skilled in the deployment of those affordances is something that we might think of as an artist's kind of prowess. And so if we have now, though, a kind of retreat from medium, and there have been various ways of diagnosing that in art historical and art critical circles for a little while now, but well, we have artists who say like, I don't work in a medium, right? Or my practice is just sort of my charismatic effulgence across all media. How does that also sort of connect to this sense of slurry or mess or mishmash, or everything is content, right? A certain kind of homogenized stream of torrent of stuff just coming at us that we're supposed to sort of be indifferent to its origins and its specificities and just sort of consume it.
So I want to read a passage from page 5 of the book, which I kind of highlighted as your thesis. You say, art is drooping. The medium is the missing. That's a play on the medium is the message, the Marshall McLuhan quote. Conventionally, art takes up a discernible medium and takes creative distance from ordinary communication or banal functionality. making an appeal to the senses that reroutes common sense. A painting isn't an efficient way to send a message or achieve a goal, but beholding its inefficient indirection can stimulate thought. In the current climate, though, art renounces its own project of mediation. Directness and literalism are the techniques, immersiveness and surety are the effects. There's a kind of a moral tone to it. I mean, you're not just observing. It is a critical book. It is like intervening critically into this, because you think that the turn to immediacy in so many things short circuits critical thought or people's ability to think slower and more thoughtfully. Am I putting that correctly?
Yeah, you are. It's true. I do think the critic's job is to understand, but also to make certain kinds of judgments that then help prepare the way for other kinds of art. And I do think that there's something lost in this contemporary style, even though the values it holds up of directness and intimacy and authenticity and sort of instant uptake seem to sometimes go with a certain kind of emancipatory vision of like democratic access, right? Like, oh, the art isn't complicated. It's a direct message because that's how it is accessible. That's how it's available to everybody. So it gets coded as authentic and democratic. But I think there's something really lost in this style when there is this renunciation of opacity or slowness, when there is a renunciation of metaphor, when everything is supposed to be instant uptake and direct message. That is a kind of imperative that comes from economic and political structures in our life that it would be good if art could help us kind of take some distance from rather than just replicate.
Yeah, I want to get to the economic structures in a second, because I think that's an extraordinary thing about your argument. I just wanted to say something your book helped me think about that I've been thinking about. It just comes up in writing about arts and culture for a popular audience, is the category of topicality, of like relevance, that like you can't just write about art. It has to be relevant to the moment. It's to deliver a message that's going to connect with the audience like right now. And that just self-selects for certain kinds of art practices, artworks, you know, street art that just delivers a very clear graphic depiction of something that's happening in the news is a news story that connects with people immediately in a way that a painting from 100 years ago isn't. And it does feel like just the dynamics of the present crush us into the now in a way that your book helped me think about.
Yeah. And I think it's really complicated and hard because a painting from 100 years ago does have things to say to the now. And maybe a teacher's job or a critic's job is to help us make those connections. And I don't think the demand for sort of relevance or connectivity itself, connective fabric, is the wrong thing. But it's the speed with which that connection is supposed to happen. It's the literalism with which that connection is supposed to happen. And it is the kind of rapid exchange of the artist is sending their message and they're telegraphing their politics, and the audience is getting it because they have to like have their hot take on it so that they can put it on their Instagram and circulate it. And then Arnett has to cover it fast and has to respond fast. And you got to get to the latest show because criticism is preempted by whatever people are posting on their Instagram of it. So there's a whole kind of ecology and economy of speed and reflexivity that doesn't allow for kind of processing and contemplation or sort of more complicated ways of connecting. The painting from 100 years ago does have something to say to us now, but you have to tease that out. You have to consider it. And that requires also thinking about context and bringing stuff into the picture. It's not just available to scroll culture where I look at it and I know instantly. Swipe left.
I'm curious, you're from the academic side of things. Do you see some of those same pressures in that world?
Oh, totally. I mean, my scholarly expertise is in 19th century literature, and I teach big classes in literature from the 18th century. And I also work on a topic called strategic presentism, ways of thinking about connecting the past to the present, ways of revealing what is not so foreign about the 19th century or even the 18th century to the 21st. I think that those pressures are real. I think that they have to do with a certain kind of cultural disregard for the past, but they have more to do with the fact that the past isn't transparently meaningful. It takes a little bit of research or a little bit of learning or a little bit of processing time to know, oh gosh, in the 19th century, they really were sort of inventing liberal democracy, and they really were sort of inventing global capitalism and imperial relations. And there is so much about how people lived their lives and made meaning in the 19th century that really bears on now, but it takes time. That bearing isn't a tweet. It's not evident in the 21st century in the same way. So I think that those pressures of like, how do you do that connective work? That's what you need a slow classroom experience for. That's what you need background homework for. There's attention span issues, but there's also time issues for students. They're working jobs. We have defunded higher education. So the students are more in debt. So time they can afford to spend on their learning is limited. All of those amount to pressures where that demand for relevance, topicality, instant guarantee that I know what this is, I got it, let's move on. Those are very evident in higher education, not just our world, for sure.
It's too bad I romanticize the room for thinking that scholars have, and it's sort of painful to read about that sort of collapsing space. Your book, as you already mentioned, is very inspired by another book by the literary thinker Frederick Jameson, Postmodernism, The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, which, if people know the term postmodernism, it's one of the big wellsprings of interest, one of the books that gave people a way to think about that term that meant more than just weird stuff that happened after 1960.
Right.
I always like to remind people that it began as a lecture at the Whitney Museum in 1982. And, art has a hand in this. It's right there in your title, which is immediacy or the style of too late capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess maybe for people who don't know, what is the core of Jameson's argument about postmodernism that interests you? Because you're updating that.
Right. So there are a couple things. There's the form of the argument, which is to go across different media and to sort of say there is such a thing as kind of a monoculture in a way. And to say also that there are distinctive historical phases of or transformations in that monoculture. So that it's possible to say about 1960s art, this really isn't modernism anymore. And then especially about 1970s and 1980s art and literature and architectural forms. So something is different. And so what is that? And then there's the method, which he, as a Marxist and dialectical cultural critic, wants to correlate those aesthetic shifts and styles and modes and genres to their kind of underlying economic base and the historical and social relations that they modulate. And for him, the explanation for sort of no longer being in modernism, there's an aesthetic way of describing what that looks like, pastiche and irony and intertextuality and the kind of playful mixing of different things that we associate as postmodernism's kind of irreverence and lack of discipline and like the Greek columns that are on like a metal form building. But there's also a set of economic conditions that he's thinking that those are reflecting, which have to do with globalization, the rise of multinational corporations, and the kind of what he follows with and is articulating with David Harvey as a kind of compression of time and space, right? So that if you have global companies and global treaties and a global flow of commerce and one world economy, that there's a certain sense of proximity of things that were formerly far away, a certain sense of kind of rapid or speeded up kind of intimacy of things that formerly took a long time. And there are shipping technological innovations and so on behind this too. And so that kind of great moment of compression of space and of time and sort of bringing different things into contact and under the rubric of the market sort of produces this culture of pastiche and this aesthetics of irony and this aesthetics of kind of weird mixing of things together.
Yeah, that's what's so exciting about his argument is that, there are these new cultural structures that are based on, physical infrastructure transformations.
Right.
Like people are getting exposed to more cultures. Right. So you have more music that calls on world cultures in a way that wasn't true before, but that also produces new mental structures that then are both connected to that, independent of that. And it's a way of kind of saying that artists don't work in a vacuum, and that one way you can read art or look at art is in relationship to what it tells you about the changing conditions of production.
Absolutely.
And how people live in the world.
It's hard to make sense of globalization. It's hard to make sense of the world market or to think about international relations, and that you as a producer of cultural texts like a painting or a poem or a song might be transmitting those out onto this global market. So what is the way that your style can help sort of reflect that heterogeneity and also help people make sense of it? And that's where he sort of sees this aesthetics of kind of just mixing and intertextuality and all the kinds of things that we associate with postmodernism's aesthetic repertoire come from, is that heterogeneous social experiment of global capitalism and the efforts to make sense of it critically and kind of just in terms of what he calls mapping, but also practically, right? That if you're somebody like Thomas Friedman and you're thinking about what is the order of international relations, the world is flat. What flatness is the real feature of postmodernism, right?
Immediacy for you and what you call immediacy style, it's about more than just the immediate. It's also about thinking about what is the kind of temperature of our times. And this seems to be like a dominant category, this drive towards immediate experience. And that feels both connected to what he was talking about in the 80s and 90s, and a little bit of a mutation, which you're linking to a mutation within, or like new forms of economic life that have developed since then. Because, like you're saying, one of Jameson's big category was flatness of affect, that everything was like irony with nothing behind it, that it was like quoting things, but there was no sense that there was an original. And immediacy, I think there's still a lot of that out there, but then there is a demand for authenticity, directness, that's very much a turn towards authenticity. And I think you're one of a number of people who are trying to like name some kind of new way that things feel. So what is that transition, and, you know, what's the underlying economic thing that you see as pushing us in that direction?
So definitely, I think we're not still in postmodernism. I think Jameson thinks that. I think lots of critics think that. So what is this new thing? What is the same about postmodernism, but what is different? And what would be the ways we could explain it? I think as you were leading with there's a demand for authenticity. Some people call it the new sincerity. There's a kind of intensity of affect, or what Jameson calls a waning in postmodernism. We might call a waxing in immediacy. There is a kind of sense of the profundities of keeping it real about the body and about identity, at the same time as there are some of these forces of blurring and indistinction and the kind of mess and slurry that we were talking about have sort of intensified beyond what postmodernism's kind of pastiche was into just real glop, you know? And so trying to sort of describe those aesthetic features as different, I have to go looking for what are some economic and political explanations of them. And one of the major theses that we have critically in the art world, in literary criticism, in architectural theory, is the idea that the digital revolution is really what can explain why culture is different in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century. Everything from social media to platform economies to email and so on.
One-click shopping. That's the one that really resonates with me as like particularly new economic thing, that it is like, it's not just that we live in a dispersed economy where things are being assembled overseas, and it is like on the consumption side, like everything's about getting things right now. And that produces a psychic structure of both getting more things, but then you got to keep the wheels of consumption turning. So it's also like you got to advertise things more. The stuff has to fill in those motors of consumption. So there's just more images circulating faster.
For sure. So that one-click shopping, you want it, we get it. Swipe left, swipe right, Postmates, the just instantaneity of I feel the desire and then I can have a personal limousine for my burrito, you know, instead of walking to go get it or whatever, which is all sold to us as flexibility, as psychically fulfilling, as fluidity, right? Like no sooner have I thought of the thing than some surf is ready to bring it to me at my door. Why do I need to bother calling a taxi company on the phone or going outside and waiting on the corner to hail one when I can just push my finger on my phone and I get the personal chauffeur right there? Those kinds of economic relations really are imparting a set of values, right? That is literally the kind of source of value, this instant transfer, this seamlessness, this idea of cutting out the middleman of the taxi company, instead having everybody's in an intimate relationship with their personal chauffeur, the customer and the laborer, but no kind of brick and mortar store, all that kind of stuff is advancing flow, connection, instant transfer, rapid exchange, direct message as real economic values. And those have, I think, been metabolized into aesthetic values. That's some form of being able to explain why we have these aesthetic turns towards direct eye contact in televisual aesthetics, or towards confessional stuff in performance art, or towards first person autofiction in literature, that we have these realms of aesthetic values that we might like to think of as innovations of genius. Oh, somebody figured out that, it's really cool if I don't work in a medium and my practice is just to emit charisma. That's so genius, except that actually belongs to a broader cultural matrix.
Yeah, actually, that's another kind of economic mutation that you come back to again and again in the chapter on literary production, in the chapter actually on scholarly production, on theory in the book, is this kind of entrepreneurial that because of this economic drive towards like removing layers of mediation, like you just have direct access to other people, other goods, other services, that for a lot of artistic people and just writers, all kinds of producers, really, that means there are less structures between you and who you're talking to. But that also means you don't have those structures to do the work of marketing things, do the work of promoting things. And so kind of the turn towards the first person in a very like personal style is also the fact that just like the agency of the individual person, they have to assume a lot more responsibility.
They're hyperinflated in the literary world, right? People used to have the jobs of marketing books, and people used to have the jobs of planning book tours and sort of cultivating interest and also evaluating books and writing criticism about them. But now the author has to be the charismatic persona with a huge Instagram following who can sell their books in advance and who only gets the book contract because it seems like they're so marketable, because they have so many followers. And there's so much just pressure on the producers of culture to have this kind of like hyper presence that is the thing that they're selling access to with their literature or with their art or with their films. And those are really transformations in how we organize culture industries that are labor transformations, that are economic and policy transformations and value transformations. So the kind of style that emerges from this of like hyper intimate, hyper personal, hyper confessional genres, that style isn't just like, oh, this person's really keeping it real with us. This person has figured out that like we can cut the shit of like all the layers of too much metaphor or characters or who needs plot or why do you have to have medium? Why do you need to have a frame around an artwork, right? Like, let me just emit, let me just give it to you, give you the goods. That stuff as aesthetic value has a whole underside, which is this decommissioning of the publishing industry and of higher education and the kind of marketization of creative writing education or of the MFA and the kind of attacks on labor in the television industry and the rise of reality TV, which is about not paying writers, so trying to just make those connections is what the book is trying to do.
I think what everyone will remember from your book is a passage you've already mentioned where you talk about the decline of the third person, the rise of the first person, which you prove empirically. I was trying to think of like equivalents in art since POV is a little different. And I realized it's probably in the wall labels, which, in some ways are a form of mediation, right? I mean, people are always complaining in art about mediation. It's like, why do I have to read a text in order to get the art? But it is also true that a lot of the wall labels just kind of tell you what the meaning is. Mm-hmm. And specifically, I think, tell you the personal story of the artist. Like, it is all the meaning routed through the biography of the artist right there. So that becomes kind of what you're consuming.
Like in Hannah Gadsby's anti-Picasso show, pieces on the wall were literally just words saying, I wanted my story to be heard, which is her, and as a quote from her show and so on. But this idea that you shouldn't have the little interpretive device and that layer of mediation of the expert curator providing you context on materials and background and some kind of questions to think about, but instead just transmitting to you the instant message of the thing, hear my story, or there reduction of things to story even.
Like, I have mixed feelings about it because, I'm a writer, so I defend mediation. Like, I think it's good. There are wall labels that, like, not everybody knows who Picasso is or knows his story or knows why people might like or dislike Picasso. So I think it's good there's interpretation. But I think what's really thought-provoking is your account of sort of what is lost when you view things only through the lens of the first person. So maybe you could go into that for a second. What is the critique here? And particularly it's a social critique, right? I mean, or it's a political critique about what structures of mediation ideally can give us.
Yeah. Just to come back to the fictional case. When you write a book in the first person, even if you're not writing it from the point of view of a character who is demographically similar to the author, even if there's some more fiction there, you are still writing it in a mode of thought, which is the one that we get to experience as ordinary humans. But the third person, none of us get to have. Like, we don't get to move around in other people's heads. We wish we did, but we don't. And you can try to become an analyst or a critic of a situation or a historian or a philosopher and be able to think abstractly, right? But none of us get to have in our sort of everyday lives the weirdness of third person fiction, of just like a consciousness that doesn't belong to an individual body. And that is a real conceptual benefit and a real artistic benefit of fiction. But it's also, I think, a political benefit because it's a way of kind of evoking something that's bigger than the personal or bigger than the individual. How do you have collective consciousness? How do you have collective meaning? Novels have done a lot of work of generating collective meaning. And people think of that as having a bad function and sort of like, oh, here's the way that novels produce the American nation or, produce a sense of what it is to be French or something like that. But it has a good basis too.
Or produced generalizations that aren't true. I mean, generalization swings both ways, of course. Like, right. I mean, I think there is a reaction to generalization and being spoken for that is about being misspoken for.
Totally. And I think that has, and I try to talk about that in the academic chapter of the book too, but like that sense of correction of collective knowledge or big narratives or speaking for others has been the real commitment intellectually and politically of a lot of people, both in and outside of the academy for 50 years now, right? And the question is sort of like, has that been an overcorrection? Has there been a real loss of some ability to legitimately speak for other people, which is some condition of solidarity sometimes, right? Is some condition of collective sovereignty sometimes, that there is a massing of interest and there's an ability to represent what the collective good might be or what the collective plan should be, what the common fabric is, what the common held meanings and truth are. And I think that we have overcorrected in our attack on generalization, our attack on abstract thinking and abstract art. And that has bad political consequences. Yeah.
Yeah, so if I could sum up, it's basically like your argument is that the relentless focus on immediacy, which comes in some ways, or at least chimes with, is useful for this underlying economic structure of like the entrepreneurial self, the hustle culture, of immediate consumption, that sort of uncritically consumed in art and literature and in philosophy, this uncritical focus on immediate experience is the only thing that matters, has the political effect of kind of isolating us and making sure that everybody's just an atom and that art doesn't help us move beyond that.
Right. That we just sort of have this ecstatic revelry about the ineffability and the unrelatability or unbridgeability of everybody's singular essence and singular experience. And everybody's just sort of supposed to replicate it, right? Like everybody should write a memoir, for instance. That's one of the things that, I position next to the decline of the third person is the absolute explosive growth of memoir as a literary genre. But again, thinking about this also in terms of confessional video aesthetics or charismatic performance art, right? That there is this kind of personalization that I do think presents itself as authentic and real, and also as, say, feminist sometimes, or as a correction to misrepresentation, or as a correction to a lack of representation or lack of institutional inclusion, right? And those harms are real, but the kind of complete casting out of or delegitimating of any kind of collective bridges or common experience or common meaning or thinking in the plural is what I think is really concerning politically.
Is it also an aesthetic criticism, though? Because I'm thinking about your chapter on video. You have a long chapter on streaming television as the art of our time, in a way, because it is almost certainly the most consumed popular art now. And you cite the art theorist Rosalind Krauss from 1973, who was talking about video art then, and talking about how video art represented the end of medium specificity, because video is everywhere. You know, it can be big, it can be small, it could be played on one kind of screen, it can be played on another one. So it presents challenges for a certain kind of rigorous way of thinking about form. And then the streaming era, which is pretty recent, kind of takes that to a whole new level. And I think you're arguing across a whole range of examples, from Emily in Paris to Fleabag to a whole bunch of other things that people will be familiar with and either totally agree with you or totally disagree with you on their character. But I think that you're arguing that there's kind of a blurring of form and kind of a laziness that comes in when there's just so much content that's designed to be consumed everywhere. Is that essentially your argument?
That is a big part of it. Yeah. That we think, oh, there's so much content and this means that there's more great stuff to watch than ever before. But the so muchness and the kind of torrent of content is the economic imperative of the streaming services. And one of the things I'm trying to say is there's a certain aesthetic homogeneity amid all this abundance. We think there's so much, but it's actually really limited. So there's a kind of set of stylistic principles or aesthetic tics that a lot of these original streaming shows have in common, even though we might think that they're catering to wide varieties of audiences. So some of those tics are things like front-facing cinematography, right? Where it's structured, where the show involves a lot of direct eye contact from the character to the viewer in ways that have radically different effects from like a Brechtian kind of theatrical fourth wall breaking. They seem to emulate the kind of device integration of like, well, I'm watching the show on my phone anyway, and that's how I talk to my grandma on FaceTime, and this is now I'm having this intimate relationship with this character from Euphoria. You know, that's just one example. There's also a kind of like attenuation of plot, this kind of just metastasized, sprawling, extreme scenes, but they don't really have a lot of narrative coherence.
It's something people talk about in streaming music, actually, which you don't go into the book, that like streaming music, because it's meant to be just like ambient, and because the model is like quantity of streams,
right,
means you get these albums that are like 40 song tracks that probably could have been honed to a closer thing, but the entire business model is just the consumption of more and more and more stuff. And that just lends to a lack of formal rigor.
To just sludge, right? They just want you to keep it going, and the autoplay and the indistinction. And I think that those economic imperatives are really important. Streaming content is most a case of the circulatory companies, right? Netflix and Amazon as distributors of goods, becoming the producers of the goods, and their values as fast distributors, as one-day shippers, or as autoplay, you know, tailored content delugers. Those economic imperatives are shaping the kind of narrative sponginess and kind of liquefied form of the content.
Is this just a matter of overproduction? There's just too much culture. I mean, sometimes I do think, you know, it's like in the modernist period, in the early 20th century, is like the dream was like, let's make everyone an artist, or let's make art life. And in the present, people consume so much TV. It is literally almost like TV. The consumption of visual media is just this layer that is almost coterminous with life. If you're on the subway in New York, you look down the subway car and literally everybody will be watching a video on their phone at all times. And so is that really what it's all about, just overproduction? And then the kind of, in that competitive market, you know, whatever asset you have, it comes back to like creating some kind of personal brand, like influencer style brand, because you're trying to stand out. That's what a brand does. It puts you above everything else.
So I think the economics and the ethics of this are tricky, because I don't know that it's true that there's too much culture. I mean, human beings love to make art, and we should do so. And we should do so for pleasure and for edification and for uselessness. And there are more people making culture than ever before on more platforms than ever before. And when you say everybody on the subway is watching video, most of them are probably watching TikTok, right? Which is the most widely used app in the world now. And this is all rapidly changed even since I wrote the book, right? But what's the content on TikTok? Most of it is not fictional. Most of it is not particularly scripted, right? It is in, again, this kind of register of authentic experiential presentation. And what are we getting there if everybody has this pressure to divulge, to constitute their base and build up their platform by self-abnegation, or also by hysterical overwork, right? If you watch like book talkers, right, they are like stressed about like not being able to read enough books to be able to keep up with their following, but they have to generate videos so that they can get,
I don't believe they read all those books.
Yeah.
I just don't believe it.
I just think that it's not that there's too much culture. It's that the culture is being produced in perilous economic ways that have emptied out the kind of value in the production process, where there should be writers and there should be education. And the individuals who are making the TikToks should have been a little bit familiar with the history of ideas and the history of art and the history of cooking so that they can have something valuable to contribute. But those require investments in how we make ourselves up. They require investments in institutions like elementary schools, and investments in the art world and in expertise and in knowledge and in the time, to go back to my students not having time to read because they're working jobs, in the time to learn and the freedom to learn. So I think that it could be easy to say there's too much culture, but I think there's too much culture being made in shitty conditions. We need better economic conditions for making culture.
I wanted to end with a little bit of a positive example, because it can be
Right.
It can be very bleak to think about the contemporary conditions of cultural production. And you do end with a bunch of things that you think do a little bit of positive mediation work. You mentioned Colson Whitehead, the novelist. You mentioned Secession, the TV show. But in the art realm, you mentioned the work by the Canadian photographer Edward Bertansky, these manufactured landscapes. So I thought, what do you find interesting about that project? And introduce it if people don't know what it is.
Sure. So he is Canadian. He is known for very large format, large scale landscapes of natural terrain, but also of unnatural terrain. So like oil refineries, say, or major factories and major dams. So great feats of engineering and infrastructure, but great kind of monuments and integuments of petroculture. And people don't like the photographs because they don't tend to have human subjects in them. They're very impersonal. I think critics don't like that and consumers don't like that. And because they cost money to make. Like achieving this kind of scale often means that he's like photographing from a helicopter.
Yeah, scale is very important to you.
Scale is super important to me, yeah.
Seeing these individually, not just seeing them on your computer screen, make the image sculptural, so to speak, because level of detail is so... In order to have the effect that's kind of like, you look at these and feel like, this is giving me a sense of just this vast scale of human impact on the earth. They're meant to be seen up close.
And that is not something that's available to you in your ordinary life when you're just driving around in your car. What is the impact of car culture on the Earth's surface? What is the impact of petrochemical refining on the prospects for the survivability of the species, right? And I think that the scale at which he takes these is meant to sort of completely counter what's experienceable or what is immediately accessible. The fact that they require resources to produce, because it's trying to give us access to a kind of thought that isn't immediately accessible or perceptible. It's impersonal. It's not personal. And I think those are real strengths. It's like the art is trying to think a thought with us and invite us to think a thought that is different from what we can just have walking around in our ordinary bodies, in our ordinary landscapes, and with our, limited perception. It's trying to enlarge what is understandable, not just what is experienceable. And I think that's really brilliant and one of the real jobs of all kinds of art across media.
Well, Anna, thank you for talking about this heady terrain, and I hope it practices a little bit what it preaches and then kind of steps back from the immediate, gives people some concepts to think about the way things are. I know your book did for me.
Thank you so much for having me and for thinking with it.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, please take a moment to rate and review The Art Angle. It helps other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.